Imagine waking up in a grand palace. Sunlight pours through tall glass windows. Paintings of kings and queens stare down from golden walls. You are not an ordinary child. You are a royal child born into the most powerful empire on earth. The year is 1880. The British Empire stretches across continents, and on the throne sits Queen Victoria. But behind the luxury and royal ceremonies, what was life really like for a child born into royalty? Was it a fairy tale? Or a life of strict discipline and overwhelming expectations? Today we step inside the royal world of Victorian Britain. In 1880, Britain stood at the height of its global power. Under the reign of Queen Victoria, the British Empire stretched across vast territories in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific. It was often said that the sun never sets on the British Empire because somewhere in the world the British flag was always flying under daylight. London was the heart of this empire, a city filled with industry, innovation, and ambition. Steam trains thundered across the countryside. Factories powered by coal transformed the economy. Ships sailed from British ports carrying goods, soldiers, and influence to distant lands. This was the world into which a royal child was born. The Victorian era was defined by strict moral codes, discipline, and a deep belief in duty. Society was carefully structured. At the top stood the monarchy not just as rulers, but as symbols of stability and national pride. Beneath them were nobles, industrial leaders, merchants, and workers. Everyone had a place. Everyone had expectations. Inside grand residences such as Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, life appeared magnificent. Crystal chandeliers illuminated vast halls. Portraits of ancestors reminded each generation of their legacy. Every room reflected centuries of tradition. But these palaces were not merely homes, they were political stages. Royal children growing up in 1880 were grandchildren of Queen Victoria and children of the future King Edward VII. From birth, their lives were intertwined with the destiny of the empire. Every gesture, every public appearance, every education decision had meaning. Foreign ambassadors observed them. Newspapers reported on them. The public admired them. They were raised not only as sons and daughters, but as future representatives of Britain's power and identity. Beyond the palace walls, the empire faced both glory and tension. Industrial progress created immense wealth, but also poverty and inequality. Political debates filled parliament. Colonies demanded attention. The world was changing rapidly, and the monarchy needed to remain strong, dignified, and respected. For a royal child, this meant growing up in a world where tradition met transformation. They lived surrounded by luxury, yet also by responsibility. Surrounded by servants, yet constantly watched by the public eye. They were not simply children of a family. They were heirs to an empire that believed it was shaping the modern world. And in 1880, that empire expected nothing less than perfection from its future kings and queens. From the very first day of their lives, royal children in 1880 were raised differently from other children. Their nurseries were elegant and spacious, filled with finely crafted furniture and carefully selected toys. Yet even in these early years, structure and discipline shaped their daily routines. Royal infants were cared for by governesses and nurses who followed strict instructions about manners, behavior, and moral upbringing. Unlike ordinary children of Britain, whether wealthy or working-class royal children did not attend public schools. Their education took place entirely within palace walls. Carefully chosen private tutors, often scholars or respected clergymen, were responsible for shaping their minds. Education was not simply about knowledge. It was preparation for leadership. They studied British history in detail, learning about past monarchs, victories, mistakes, and constitutional limits of royal power. They were taught constitutional law so they would understand the delicate balance between the monarchy and parliament. Foreign languages were essential. French was considered the language of diplomacy, and German was common due to strong royal family ties across Europe, especially through Queen Victoria, whose family connections extended into German states. A royal child needed to communicate confidently with foreign rulers and ambassadors. Geography lessons were not ordinary maps and rivers. They studied the vast reach of the British Empire, India, Canada, Australia, Africa. They were taught that these distant lands were part of a global system under British influence. Science and mathematics were included to reflect the rapidly modernizing world of the Industrial Revolution. Britain was advancing technologically, and its future monarchs needed awareness of innovation and progress. But education went far beyond academics. Etiquette was constant and precise. Royal children were trained how to walk into a room, how to bow correctly, how to shake hands, how to address nobles, and how to maintain calm expressions in public. Even posture mattered. They practiced standing straight for long ceremonies and speaking clearly without hesitation. Music and the arts were also considered essential. Playing the piano, understanding classical compositions, and appreciating fine art were part of refined royal culture. Discipline was central to this upbringing. Queen Victoria believed strongly in moral character, self-control, and duty. She valued seriousness over indulgence and expected her descendants to represent dignity at all times. Playtime did exist. Children rode ponies, walked in palace gardens, or played quiet games indoors, but even play was supervised. There were boundaries, schedules, and expectations. Royal childhood was not carefree. It was structured, intentional, and deeply purposeful. These children were not only growing up, they were being carefully shaped into symbols of an empire. A royal child's day in 1880 was not spontaneous. It followed structure almost like a carefully written script. The morning began early. At around 6:30 a.m., a servant or governess would gently wake the young prince or princess. The room itself was grand high ceilings, embroidered curtains, polished wooden furniture, but the atmosphere was quiet and disciplined. There was no rushing, no chaos. Everything moved with calm precision. After washing and dressing, the child would prepare for breakfast at 7:30 a.m. Breakfast was not casual, it was formal. The table was neatly arranged with fine china, silver utensils, and proper seating arrangements. Even at a young age, royal children were expected to sit properly, speak politely, and follow strict table manners. Meals were part of training. Conversation during breakfast could include discussions about current events, imperial news, or family matters. Royal children were encouraged to listen carefully and speak thoughtfully. By 8:30 a.m., formal lessons began. Tutors would arrive with books and materials. The morning hours were reserved for the most serious academic subjects: history, languages, mathematics, and political studies. Lessons were focused and demanding. A royal child could not simply be intelligent. They had to demonstrate discipline and composure while learning. There were short breaks, but they were structured as well. Even rest time followed a schedule. At 1:00 p.m., a light lunch was served. Again, the setting remained formal. Royal children rarely ate alone. Staff members were always nearby. The presence of servants was constant, opening doors, arranging chairs, preparing clothing, and maintaining order. In the afternoon, the routine shifted slightly toward physical and cultural development. Boys might practice horse riding in the palace grounds or train in fencing to build strength and confidence. Riding was especially important. It symbolized leadership and control. Girls often practiced music, painting, or refined social skills, though some also rode horses or participated in outdoor activities depending on the family's preferences. Supervised walks through palace gardens were common. These walks were peaceful but rarely private. A governess, tutor, or attendant was always present. Even play had dignity. As evening approached, the atmosphere became more formal again. The child might spend time reading literature, practicing music, or reviewing lessons from earlier in the day. In some cases, they would attend formal dinners with adults, dressed in elegant, often uncomfortable clothing designed to reflect royal status. Posture was important. Speech was measured. Emotions were controlled. Privacy was rare. Every movement carried meaning because the child represented the crown. Servants observed. Family members evaluated. The expectations of the empire rested quietly in the background. From sunrise to nightfall, the palace was not simply a home. It was a place of preparation. A royal child in 1880 did not just live within those walls. They were being shaped, day by day, into a future symbol of the British Empire. Being born into the British royal family in 1880 meant inheriting more than privilege. It meant inheriting expectation. From the moment a royal child could walk and speak, they were reminded directly or indirectly that their life did not fully belong to them. It belonged to the crown, to tradition, and to the people of the empire. For the eldest son especially, the pressure was immense. He was not simply a child, he was a future king in preparation, just as Edward VII had once been prepared under the watchful eye of Queen Victoria. Every lesson, every public appearance, every word spoken in formal settings was part of long-term training. Royal children attended official ceremonies from a young age. They stood beside senior members of the family during state occasions. They met visiting diplomats and foreign royalty. They learned how to bow correctly, how to maintain calm facial expressions, and how to represent dignity even when tired or nervous. Diplomacy became part of childhood. While other children were discovering freedom and individuality, royal children were learning restraint. They were taught to think carefully before speaking, to avoid emotional outbursts, and to place duty above personal preference. Privacy was limited. Newspapers followed their lives. Society observed their behavior. A simple mistake, a misstep during a ceremony or inappropriate comment could quickly become public criticism. Failure was not easily forgiven. There was also emotional pressure within the family itself. Monarchs of the Victorian era believed strongly in discipline, moral strength, and responsibility. Affection existed, but it was often expressed through high standards rather than softness. Royal children grew up understanding that their future would involve sacrifice, long hours of public service, endless ceremonies, and limited personal freedom. The crown symbolized honor and stability, but it also carried weight. And for a child growing up in 1880, that weight was felt long before they were old enough to fully understand it. Beyond the palace gates, the reality of Britain in 1880 was far less glamorous. While royal children studied languages and rode horses in vast gardens, thousands of ordinary children woke before sunrise to work in factories, textile mills, and coal mines. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain into a global economic power, but that transformation came at a human cost. In industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham, smoke from factory chimneys filled the air. Streets were crowded, noisy, and often dirty. Working-class families lived in small, cramped housing with limited sanitation. For many children, education was a luxury they could not afford. Instead of tutors and music lessons, they faced long hours of labor in dangerous conditions. Some worked in coal mines, crawling through narrow tunnels. Others operated heavy machinery in textile factories. The work was exhausting, and the pay was minimal. Childhood for many was short and harsh. Meanwhile, inside residences such as Buckingham Palace, royal children were surrounded by servants, comfort, and protection. Their lives were structured around education and preparation, not survival. The contrast was striking. On one side of Britain stood unimaginable wealth and imperial pride. On the other stood poverty, struggle, and inequality. Yet the comparison is not entirely simple. Royal children lived in comfort, but they lived under constant scrutiny and pressure. Working-class children had hardship and danger, but sometimes more personal freedom within their communities. One life carried physical struggle. The other carried psychological and symbolic weight. It invites a powerful reflection. Was royal life truly easier, or was it simply a different kind of responsibility, one that demanded sacrifice in ways less visible but equally heavy? The life of a royal child in 1880 was not a simple fairy tale. Yes, there were grand palaces, elegant clothing, and rooms filled with history. Yes, there was comfort, protection, and privilege beyond imagination. But behind the glittering chandeliers and golden crowns stood something far more complex. There was expectation. There was discipline. There was the quiet understanding that personal dreams would always stand second to duty. A royal child did not grow up asking, "What do I want to become?" The question was already answered at birth. They were shaped to become symbols of stability, tradition, and national pride in the era of Queen Victoria. Every smile in public, every appearance at a ceremony, every carefully spoken word carried the weight of an empire that believed in its own greatness. And yet, beneath the titles and formal portraits, there was still a child. A child who felt pressure, a child who made mistakes, a child who carried responsibility long before fully understanding it. So as we look back at 1880, we must ask ourselves, if you were given the choice, a life of freedom and anonymity, or a life of power and permanent duty, would you choose the crown?